The craziest prison escape in history. The Great Escapees of Alcatraz. Alcatraz was supposed to be escape-proof. The prison sat on an island surrounded by freezing water and powerful currents. But in June 1962, 3 prisoners, Frank, John, and Clarence, disappeared from their cells. The guards initially had no idea. Why? Because the prisoners had placed dummy heads in their beds. The heads were designed to make it look as though the men were sleeping. Behind the scenes, the prisoners had spent months preparing. They had secretly widened ventilation openings and constructed a route out of the prison. Then they escaped onto the island's shoreline and disappeared into the night. Authorities found evidence suggesting they had attempted to cross the bay, but no bodies were ever conclusively found. The FBI eventually closed its investigation. Were they swept away by the cold waters? Or did they actually make it to the mainland? More than 6 decades later, the mystery remains. And that's why the Alcatraz escape is still one of the most famous unsolved prison mysteries in history. The Andersonville Escape. During the American Civil War, Andersonville was one of the most notorious Confederate prison camps. Escape was extremely difficult. Of the tens of thousands of prisoners held there, only a tiny fraction successfully escaped and ultimately reached Union lines. Some prisoners tried to tunnel, others attempted to sneak past guards, some simply ran. But here's what makes the story so fascinating. Even when someone managed to escape the prison itself, they still weren't safe. They had to survive outside the camp. They needed food, they needed water, and they had to avoid being captured and returned. The National Park Service records only a very small number of confirmed successful escapes from Andersonville, showing just how difficult it was to get away and actually reach safety. For the few who disappeared into the chaos of the Civil War, their stories were sometimes never fully documented. And that's the terrifying truth about historical prison escapes. The Frank Grigware escape. In 1910, Frank Grigware was serving a life sentence at the United States Penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas. But Grigware wasn't planning to spend the rest of his life behind bars. He and 5 other prisoners managed to escape using an incredibly bold trick. They carved a piece of wood to look like a revolver. Then they used it to fool the guards. But their escape didn't end there. The prisoners seized a locomotive used to transport supplies and inmates and used it to smash their way out of the prison complex. Grigware disappeared. For years, authorities searched for him. Eventually, investigators discovered that he had escaped to Canada. But here's where the story gets strange. Grigware was eventually identified and arrested in Canada, but then escaped custody again and vanished from the authorities' reach. The FBI describes his case as one of its longest-running fugitive investigations. But this wasn't the last time someone would make an impossible prison escape look easy. The Yoshie Shiratori escape. Yoshie Shiratori became famous in Japan for something that sounds almost unbelievable. He escaped from prison. Then he did it again and again. Shiratori became known as a master escape artist, reportedly escaping from several prisons during his lifetime. One of the most famous stories involves a prison cell where he was supposedly able to exploit weaknesses in the structure and escape. But his story wasn't simply about running away. Each time he was captured, authorities tried to make his prison more secure. And each time, Shiratori seemed to find another way out. Eventually, after years of imprisonment and escape, he was released. His story became legendary in Japan. But there's an interesting lesson in his story. Sometimes the most dangerous prison isn't the one with the strongest walls. It's the one where the guards believe escape is impossible. And when guards stop expecting an escape, that's when an escape artist becomes truly dangerous. The prison collapse escape. Some prisoners don't escape because they have a brilliant plan. Sometimes history simply gives them an opportunity. During wars, revolutions, natural disasters, and political collapses, prisons can suddenly become vulnerable. Guards disappear, buildings are damaged, security systems fail. Prisoners realize that the walls that once trapped them are no longer strong enough. This happened throughout history, especially during periods of war. Some prisoners escaped during bombings, others walked out when guards abandoned their posts, and some simply disappeared into the chaos. The problem for investigators was obvious. If thousands of people were fleeing at once, how could you tell which person was an escaped prisoner? A man could throw away his prison clothes, find civilian clothing, and disappear into a crowd. And once he crossed a border, he could become almost impossible to find. For some prisoners, the greatest escape plan wasn't a tunnel. It was simply waiting for the world around them to fall apart.